The big news from the final debate of 2020 has nothing to do with the candidates. I have something to show you today that will equip you heading into the final week before the election with a little bit of a smarter perspective. First off, here's what you should know about the final debate. Instead of the stormy chaos of the first debate, we had mixed skies with moments, glimpses of civility. Each side scored points and each side gave me a little something that I'd like to look further into over the weekend. But what you should know is that these are the big picture closing arguments from both candidates. President Trump's message can be summed up in this one line from the debate. He said, "Success will bring us together." He's arguing Joe Biden is just a typical politician, all talk and no action, who spent 47 years in office, including 8 as vice president. President Trump reiterated his priority is a strong, open American economy during the COVID-19 pandemic, saying that the cure cannot be worse than the problem itself. On the other side, former Vice President Joe Biden's message could be summed up in this one line from the debate. He said, "What is on the ballot is the character of the country." He says he will be the president not of red states, not of blue states, but of the United States. And he really went after the president for his past in office, his recent past, as well as his personality. And he really criticized President Trump for his COVID-19 response, saying, he says, meaning the president, that we're learning to live with it, live with COVID-19, but people are learning to die with it. Okay, you've probably heard a little bit of both of those arguments before from each candidate. And what's interesting is that both candidates are sharing a similar strategy. They're using the other person to define their argument for why they should be elected president. Remember, for both of these candidates, they're still looking at that undecided voter, that exotic, elusive, undecided voter that's sort of like Bigfoot. Does it exist? Does it not exist? No one really knows. So that's why I think the real story of the presidential debate doesn't have to do with the candidates. It has to do with the coverage and the story that's already being told to the American people. Ahead of the debate and after the debate, there was a lot of talk about polling that favors Joe Biden. Now, you'll notice we don't use a lot of polling on Smarter News. I happen to not like polling. I actually find it boring. I also don't find it exactly helpful for telling a story, because if the polls asked someone last week how they feel about the election, does that accurately reflect how they're feeling this week? That's a big question. But I also learned a really valuable lesson in 2016 in my reporting. I was speaking to a pollster. This was a couple weeks before the election, and they were expressing concern about the quality of their data. They noticed some discrepancies in how people were answering questions about who they would vote for at the time. And because the people were inconsistent about what they were saying or what they were willing to share, the pollster just wondered how accurate the polling really was. And of course, what we saw in the results of 2016 is that the polling did not predict the results. So last night, I wanted a little bit of context. And when I do want to look at polling, I look at a website called Real Clear Politics. What they do is they take polling from all over the place, throw it into a pot, mix it together, and see what comes out. And I like that because a lot of the polling can be different, but when you average it out together, it gives you a picture that I think can actually be useful. So here's what the polling shows.
This is a look at the top battleground states in 2016 and 2020. These are the states that arguably will decide the election. They include Wisconsin, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Florida, Arizona, and Michigan. So let's scroll down. And when we scroll down, we can see what it looked like in these top battleground states in 2016 and what it looks like today at the exact same time, 11 days before the election. If you look at the lower graph, you can see that Hillary Clinton led Donald Trump in these key battleground states by 3.8 points 11 days before the election. If you look at the top, you can see that Joe Biden leads President Trump by 4 points 11 days before the election. It's almost the identical margin that's favoring the Democrat candidate.
Now, Joe Biden is not Hillary Clinton. 2020 is not 2016. There are some really marked differences, but the similarities in those battleground states are notable. Why? Because President Trump in 2016 didn't just win one of those battleground states. Despite the polling, he won all of them. You are constantly hearing the drumbeat that there are record voter turnout numbers right now. We could be around 50 million early voters at this time, which is huge. But every time you hear that number, think about this. There are expectations that we could see 150 million Americans vote in this election, which means 100 million people haven't voted yet. And yes, our elections are not decided by popular vote. So it sort of depends on where those 100 million people are, how they're sprinkled out throughout the battleground states. But we need to leave room for a lot to happen over the next 10, 11 days. And every time you hear about the polling information or you hear about voter turnout, I want you to think about what happened in 2016 and the fact that even with the huge early voting turnout, we still have many, many Americans who have yet to vote. So this is what you really need to know. There were a few zingers last night. It was a solid debate. Both sides are claiming victories. But this election is not over. And journalists who are telling the story as if it is are repeating a mistake that we saw in 2016. Because ultimately, the story that many were telling wasn't actually an accurate story. And that's why I feel compelled to share this with you today. I have no idea, zero idea of what's going to happen in the 2020 election. But my promise to you is that we're not going to tell the story before it develops. There's a lot that can happen, and we're here for it. And we're here for you. Questions and comments, let me know. And as always, more on smarternews.com.